Today we're going to be looking at how the United States looks today. Obviously very different than it did when we first got started in 1787. We're going to be focusing on the following things: geography and population change. When we started off, we were primarily a rural country, and now we're primarily an urban and suburban country. We'll also be looking at the tremendous changes in ethnicity and race, changes in religion, economy, and the type of government that we live in, which obviously is still a constitutional republic, but very different in the way it actually expresses itself. So when you look at the map, and you look at the map on the left, we were obviously originally a rural country, very much on the coastline. Now we're a continental country, which is defined by megaregions, and megaregions are built around large urban areas, which, at least in the north, focused around the industrial core of the 19th century. So if you look at the map and you look at New England and going down towards Washington, D.C., you'll see a big corridor of densely populated areas, and that follows the old development of the cities along the coastline and in through the Great Lakes, Chicago, down into Florida and over in California. These are large urban areas which define the major population density of our country. If you look at our voting patterns, in the red areas are Republican, the blue areas are Democrat, you'll notice that the heavily populated areas tend to be Democratic voting areas, and the red areas, the rural areas, tend to vote Republican. And that's interesting. We'll get more into how those patterns play out. But it's interesting to think cities vote Democrat, generally speaking, and countryside votes Republican. In terms of race, when we first started out, we were about 80% white, a large number of British and Irish settlers, about 20% African American. Many of those people were enslaved people. And obviously that black-white definition, which we were originally, has tremendously changed. We have a lot more Hispanic people in our population. We have a large Asian population and a large multiracial population as well. If you look at the changes over time, you'll notice that the white population is declining in percentage as the Hispanic and Asian populations are increasing, which is a major, major shift in the way we are defined as a people. So we go from a population that was once largely white, Northern European, English-speaking, to one that's way more multicultural. A lot more families are multiracial, multicultural, mixes of black, white, Asian, and that's an important change in American history, and one that's beginning to define our politics increasingly. If you think about the Republican Party, still primarily a white party, the Democratic Party tends to be more multicultural and multiracial, and Kamala Harris is a good example of that kind of future of the country in terms of her identity as part African American, part Asian American, and even part white. So if you look at American ethnic groups, obviously smattered throughout the country, African Americans are in larger concentrations in the South, also in certain urban areas of the North. Asians are also mixed in through the northern areas, primarily in areas around large cities. Hispanic populations tend to be concentrated down in Texas, New Mexico, Southern California, but also into North Carolina and into the other states as well. Native Americans in the West, who have been pushed out through this whole history, we obviously haven't mentioned them yet. We define ourselves against Native Americans initially as a country. It's interesting to think about who we define ourselves against. Islamic terrorists, Hispanic immigrants, often people of color, right? So when we define ourselves as a country, frequently we're defining ourselves as a white country. And obviously that gets increasingly complicated as we are actually a much more non-white country over time. So if you look at the major change in our identity over the last 200 years, we go from a country that was primarily agricultural, rural, to one that is dominated by gigantic urban cities. That's the biggest transition of all of the ones we're going to be looking at. We'll be looking at that throughout the course. If you look at our religions, we're obviously very religiously diverse. We're still a predominantly Protestant country, We were originally almost an entirely Protestant country. If you look at the statistic up in the upper right here, 98% Protestant, now much less than that, but we still have a very strong evangelical core. And if you look at how religious we obviously are much more religious in the South. Those dark blue areas are areas that are much more traditionally religious. And if you look at where we are in that upper right-hand corner, fewer and fewer people here are practicing organized religion. So we are in a kind of a cultural bubble here in New England. Particularly people who are not particularly religious do not represent the majority of Americans. So we've kind of transitioned over time from a traditional farming community to an industrial community. If you look at the lower left, which translated into agriculture, which basically destroyed our small farms. And now, if you think about it, many of our corporations like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, we are now in a post-industrial economy, largely tech-based, service-based, and we've moved from a print culture society, as you see on the left, to a much more computer-based society on the right, as this video is an indication of. So if you look at our professions, obviously both the more desirable jobs on the right, many of these may be professions that your parents may be involved in: financial management, lawyers, engineers, sales managers, corporate management, those sorts of things, which obviously are professions that earn a lot of money. But if you look at the majority of Americans, right, those are not the kinds of jobs that they have. They tend to be in retail, office clerks, nurses, waitresses, things like that. So to finish up, we live in a country which defines itself in opposition to many things: the fear of foreign intervention in elections, as was the case with Putin in the last election, fear of Trump if you are a Democrat, right? Fear of fascism if you're a Republican, fear of socialism. It's interesting that both sides define themselves that way: fear of immigration, and ultimately the way that we're defining ourselves now in the midst of the COVID crisis, increased differences between rich and poor people, people of color and white people. So those tensions still exist. And those are all things that we want to be looking at when we think about modern America. So hopefully that gave you a brief overview, and we'll elaborate on this in class.